must be very bored in life. So I'm pleased to be addressing you. I was trying to think about the type of talk I would give you, and I was told my money out to keep it simple. I don't know what that suggests about the audience, but I can tell you that my talk today is a bit more optimistic than I normally do, which is very un-Scottish. It's just so terrible not to leave a room without people crying. It is not naive to believe we can affect change, real change, through cooperation, through advocacy, and through the ballot box. But it is naive to think that we can just sit back and get it. It is this commitment to justice and the rule of law that has kept me fighting for Omar Khadr for the past 13 years and continuing, and which enabled me to keep my promise to him that I would never walk away. And I had wanted to walk away many times. And there have been times when I have become exhausted by the journey, or ashamed at the extent to which I have put my family's financial security at risk, or the fact that I've missed both my son's high school graduations because I was in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And throughout all those years I've always had, which is important, support of my wonderful wife Patricia. And however, I should explain to you about what I mean when I talk about the rule of law. I've long viewed law as a means to advance human rights and social justice issues, essentially using law to temper excessive power. Notwithstanding that law at times moves at glacial speed, but I still believe we get there in the end. And there are those who see the rule of law in negative terms, as a constraint upon freedom and creativity, as a series of traps for the unwary, or as a set of rules designed to stifle initiative and enterprise. And there are those who may see the Constitution as a means of enabling courts to frustrate the will of elected parliaments. Just listen to Harper's whining and complaining. To some, the rule of law is thought to require police to investigate and bring to prosecution every aspect of the rule book, no matter how harmless or incidental it might be. That is not what law is about. The rule of law is meant to be a safeguard, not a menace. Law can be a great equalizer, whether to promote justice and individual liberty, or as a restraint upon excessive power. I view law not as the enemy of liberty, but its partner. And it is by upholding our principles, our values, are we able to uphold and maintain the rule of law. And so it's by your commitment to a stronger community, to a fairer and compassionate society, that wrongs are righted and society is recalibrated back on track to a shared humanity where human rights are respected. It is only by your efforts the public is made aware that the right to justice and equality is not derived from any ownership of any country, or the membership of any nation, or the colour or creed of any individual, but it is the universal entitlement of every human being. The health of civil liberties and civil rights in any society is directly related to our willingness as citizens to stand up and speak out for our beliefs in the public arena. And in doing so, we are ensuring that our children and their children's children are inheriting a better future. Because I say that because we're fighting for more than the safety of our citizens, though that is an important objective. But we're also fighting for the preservation of our democratic way of life, our right to freedom of thought and expression, and our commitment to the rule of law. Those liberties which have been won hard over the centuries and which we must hold dear. If you consider that the Supreme Court of Canada, in a major rebuke to the former Liberal government, ruled that the US treatment of Omar Khadr in Guantanamo Bay contravened the International Convention on Torture and the Geneva Conventions, and that Canada was complicit in that misconduct. I spent 5 years getting to the Supreme Court to get that decision. And the next day when I woke up, I expected the phones to be ringing off and the people standing out my door in the thousands saying thank you. And there was silence. And a few years later, the Supreme Court of Canada requested the Canadian government to intercede with the US government and bring Omar Khadr home to Canada. And the Harper government refused. And as a result, Omar was persuaded to plead guilty to charges he denied in order to avoid spending the rest of his life in that hellhole called Guantanamo Bay. And it was only recently the UN Committee Against Torture criticised Canada for being complicit in torture involving 3 Canadian Arab men, Mr. Amalki, Mr. El-Mati, and Mr. Nureddin. And closer to home, one is only to turn the clock back to 2006, when a Canadian Commission of Inquiry, led by Dennis Edney, then Associate Chief Justice of Ontario, found that the actions of Canadian officials likely led to the rendition of Maharar to Syria, where he experienced torture. And I say to you that surely there can no greater rebuke levied against the government, its elected representatives and others that purport to uphold the rule of law than to have been complicit in something that is real and something that is horrifying against one of its citizens, namely torture. And it's only by requiring governments to adhere strictly to the rule of law, including the core standards and obligations of international human rights law and humanitarian law, are we able to define the boundaries of permissible and legitimate state action. And in doing so, we make the bigots and the racists accountable before law. The right to justice and equality, of course, as you've heard many times, is a universal entitlement of every human being. However, justice must not only be an idea, it must also be realized. So take, for example, the inspiring story of Sadiq Khan, the British, Pakistani and Muslim son of immigrants, whose father was a bus driver and his mother a seamstress, who was recently elected as the Mayor of London, England. In doing so, he made political history. He secured the largest number of votes of any individual political figure. More than 1 million votes were cast for Mr. Khan in what was a bitterly divisive and racially charged campaign orchestrated by the Conservative Party and its candidate, Zac Goldsmith. And by becoming Mayor of London, Mr. Khan also became the first directly elected Muslim mayor in one of the most important cities in the Western world. And this matters, possibly much more than it should, and the fact that it matters speaks about Islamophobia and racism in 2016. Even days after his win, the Islamophobia and innuendos from the Conservative Party and a number of political pundits on BBC continued seeping out. It even took Prime Minister David Cameron more than a day to congratulate Mr. Khan on his victory. And his Defence Secretary, speaking on BBC radio, refused to answer a very simple question, confirming that London is safe under the leadership of a Londoner who happens to be a Muslim. And Mr. Khan is British. He has that particular London accent, having been born and raised in London. But it was his identity as a Muslim that was at the centre of one of the most toxic and insidiously racist political campaigns of recent times. A campaign the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, described simply as part of the rough and tumble of democracy as he defended the Conservative campaign. And yet, Mr. Khan didn't walk away. He persevered, he won, and therefore he made a difference. And Mr. Khan's victory is a huge symbolic moment for all of us who are tired of the bigoted, divisive, fascist language we hear every day, particularly in the presidential debates south of the border. And a significant number of people who voted for Mr. Khan, an estimated 40%, were not Muslims or members of London's ethnic communities. Londoners came out to vote in big numbers and rejected the politics of bigotry. And this is a lesson for all of us if we wish Canada to become a healthier, more inclusive country. We must build shared relationships with diverse groups, regardless of colour or creed. But just as important, Mr. Khan's victory tells us we can be successful against bigotry and racism when we refuse to hide or slide into apathy. And anyone here or elsewhere who thinks this moment in London demonstrates how tolerant and at ease Britain is with the shift in demographics, ethnic minorities and Muslim population is deluding himself. Now, more than ever, we are seeing Islamophobia and bigotry pouring out. And this is not a new phenomenon. In the past, American Jews have been subjected to virulent anti-Semitism, often with the acquiescence of government or its apathy. And Catholics were also victims of religious prejudice. As recent as 50 years ago, some questioned whether a Catholic should be president. Would John F. Kennedy be directed by the Pope rather than the American people? And Mormons continue to be ridiculed for their religious beliefs. But today, we are now witnessing a surge in anti-Muslim bigotry in North America. It is evident that this surge is taking place with greater force now than it did after 9/11. That's my own perspective, having been in and out of America, going to Guantanamo Bay ever since 2003, 2004. And we only have to consider the Republican campaign that has been built on fear, bigotry, and racism with candidates competing with each other by proposing outrageous policies that are both vile and xenophobic. And these policies are simply intended to alienate and to segregate Muslims from the mainstream of American society as undesirables. Echoing the anti-Semitism policies carried out in Nazi Germany, when ghettos were set up across Europe to segregate and to confine Jewish citizens. And the ideology espoused by these presidential candidates has rarely reared its head publicly since the Second World War. Instead, that language has lurked in dark corners since then, and we've now forgotten the name of it. The right name, the correct name, the historically accurate name is simply fascism. And in fighting Islamophobia, we are also fighting for the preservation of our democratic way of life, our right to equality, and so on. And one has to look no further than Guantanamo Bay to understand how easy it is for a nation to fall into lawlessness when you don't get the balance right with security on the one hand and civil liberties on the other. And Guantanamo has been called everything from an offshore concentration camp to a legal black hole. It's a complex of brutal prisons where hundreds of men and youths from all over the world have been held by the US government under incredibly inhuman conditions and consistently incessant, vicious interrogations. And by our silence, each and every one of us here are complicit, because none of us can consider ourselves part of a civil society when we allow a place like Guantanamo Bay to exist. And these descriptors I've just given to you should come as no surprise to anybody. Because it was in January in 2002 we witnessed the first shocking images of detainees, human beings, hooded and shackled for transportation across the Atlantic to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, much as other human beings had been carried in slave ships 400 years earlier. And on their arrival in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, we witnessed the humiliation of these anonymous human beings unloaded on the tarmac like so much human baggage, to then be transported to open-air wire cages that would be their homes for many years, and all without access to family, friends, lawyers, human rights organizations, or any semblance of due process or judicial oversight. And the photos that we witnessed of detainees in orange jumpsuits, crouched in open cages, cuffed, hooded and masked, while kneeling at the feet of US soldiers, became emblematic of how the US intended to fight its war on terror. And for the watching world, which is you and I, no knowledge of humanitarian conventions was needed to understand that what we were witnessing was simply unlawful. This was not a manifestation of the Geneva Conventions at work, nor was it an act of deportation or extradition. It was far, far worse. It was the unlawful transportation to a world outside the reach of law, and intended to remain so. And in that world, crimes against humanity were to be carried out in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And amongst those detainees, of course, was a 15-year-old boy, Omar Khadr. I remember, as I digress, being in New York and approached by a representative of Human Rights Watch who said to me, "You know, Dennis, did you know that the Bush administration contacted us to repatriate the many children that had been in Guantanamo Bay? And this is about 2003, 2004. And I said, no, I didn't. And he said, and we did. We repatriated them all. Some we couldn't find homes for, but we got them out of Guantanamo. But the one name that wasn't on the table was that of a 15-year-old Canadian boy. And I, having journeyed for 13 years on behalf of Omar, I arrived in Guantanamo as a pretty experienced lawyer, had done all kinds of high-profile cases. But nothing ever readied me for Guantanamo Bay. I went there and I came out there as a pretty sad guy. I walked in there as maybe a conceited lawyer, and I walked out of there as a very, very sad father. And I recall my first time meeting Omar. And what the media doesn't tell you is that apart from the cages, there are 3 secret prisons in Guantanamo. Concrete buildings in the desert, surrounded by all kinds of wire and security, and windowless. And I remember walking in to see Omar for the very first time, because Omar spent most of his life in one of those secret prisons. In fact, as I digress, I keep digressing, that first time I saw him and I came out of that prison, I spoke with the Department of Foreign Affairs official who was present in Guantanamo. And I said to her, if we don't get him out of there, he's going to die. And she said, I know. And then she asked me not to let anybody know that I talked to her. She didn't want to lose her job. And well, I won't tell you what she is now. And so when I walked into that cell, the first thing that hit me was, it was freezing. And I'm not talking cold, I'm talking freezing. And over the years I learned that was one of the techniques. Every cell was kept freezing so that you could never sleep properly. You were always uncomfortable, you were always tired and exhausted. And there, sitting on the edge of a bed without any blankets, chained to a floor, and I should tell you, in all the years that I went to Guantanamo, I never saw Omar walk. He was always chained to a floor. It's almost as I was reading a book from some medieval period. And there was this boy, it reminded me of a broken sparrow. He had all kinds of injuries, and he had just withdrawn into himself. And when I left there, that imagery has affected me ever since. And so I made a promise that I wouldn't leave him, and I've tried to keep that up. And so when I look back upon my journey over the many years, I would never have envisaged that the history of the new century would encompass the collapse of moral order, the destruction and the distortion of fundamental legal principles and constitutional principles that have been in place since the 17th century. We all appear to have forgotten the lessons of the 17th century Star Chamber, where the accused were submitted to torture, to accusations based on secret evidence, heard by a secret court, while being shackled in the extremes of isolation. And the worst excesses of the past year, since 2002, should have sounded loud alarms to all of us, and not the least because of that precise historic parallel to the Star Chamber. We are witnesses to habeas corpus being abandoned, secret courts being created to hear secret evidence. I've spent many years going in and out of secret courts. Guilt inferred by association, and torture and rendition nakedly justified, and vital international conventions consolidated in the aftermath of the Second World War. The Geneva Conventions, the Refugee Conventions, the Torture Conventions, and many more have been deliberately avoided or ignored in the war on terror by many Western governments, including our own. And it was into this hellish world, of course, that a young Canadian boy, as I initially said, Omar Khadr, was abandoned by all of us, by our government. I was told at an earlier stage that all I needed was for the Prime Minister, whether it was the Liberal or Conservative, to speak to the President. A big man speaks to a big man kind of male talk. Every other Western country did so, and they got the detainees out of Guantanamo Bay, adults, each and every one of them. And respective Canadian governments refused to do so. I can tell you I was involved in the negotiation. I'd forced Omar, essentially forced him to take a plea bargain because first of all I had prepared all summer for the trial. I had witnesses all lined up, and when I arrived in Guantanamo Bay for the trial, I was told that no witnesses were allowed in for Omar Khadr. And the military team that I was supposed to, that I couldn't fire because I'm forced to have them, they weren't around. They were on the beach swimming. They were having a good time, and the office looked so clean. No work had been done for trial. And at the trial, I would never call it a trial. What I say is, in my time, you know, my mother, when I was a kid, sometimes accused me I should be ashamed of my behaviour. I'm not going to tell you what it was, and she's not around to tell you. But I tell you, I've never been ashamed of myself as a lawyer until I participated in that sham trial called at Guantanamo Bay. And so I knew that I had to get Omar out, and he didn't want to plead guilty to being a terrorist. And it was Hillary Clinton who came on board and persuaded Harper to participate in the plea bargain. And the plea bargain was Omar would spend one more year in Guantanamo, and then we'd send him back to Canada